G'day and welcome to Recap, Per Capita's premier podcast where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in a fight for a fairer Australia. My name's Shirley Jackson. I'm a political economist and the founder and director of the Centre for New Industry at Per Capita. I'm your host for this special edition of Recap, which is being recorded in Washington D.C, where I've been on a study tour of America to find out a little bit more about some of the big announcements that have been made regarding the Australian-American relationship. However, before we get stuck into this exciting episode and introduce our guest, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we meet on, because just like in Australia, this land belonged to a First Peoples long before people who look like me ever stepped foot on these shores. I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to and apologies if I'm butchering this, Nacotchtank and the broader Algonquin peoples who inhabited these lands for thousands of years before our arrival. These were a prosperous trading peoples who had a sophisticated and complex culture based around the waterways and lands where Washington D.C. now sits, and like many First Peoples, they've been displaced, dispossessed and devastated by colonial expansion in the area. I want to acknowledge their continued struggle for recognition and justice and extend my solidarity to them. I also want to acknowledge and pay my respects to any First Peoples who might be listening here today, either in the US or back home in Australia, and acknowledge that wherever we are, this place is, was, and always will be First Nations land. Okay, so today on Recap, we're going to take a closer look at the Australian-American relationship, and in particular, we're going to be discussing the AUKUS agreement and what it might mean for Australian industry. And a huge shout out to our friends at the Washington D.C. office of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who have very kindly let us use their recording studio today. But to help me unpack this complicated and compelling topic, I'm so thrilled to be joined by a friend of Per Capita who's based right here in Washington, D.C. He's an assistant professor of economics at the George Washington University, a former economist with the Australian Treasury, and Emma's favourite sparring partner from the ABC, Dr. Stephen Hamilton. Welcome to Recap. How you doing?
G'day, mate. Great to be here.
Yes, so excited that we could have you here today. It's been really, really exciting for me. This has been my first time in the US. And I've been really struck by how it's both the best and the worst experiences that I've had in some ways. But I'd really love to get your take, first of all, on America more broadly. What is you love about it, why you live here, if there's anything that you're less keen on, and what it's like being an Australian here in the US.
It's a difficult. Now I have to think carefully about how I'm going to offend all the. How many Americans listen to this podcast?
Probably not too many.
So, look, I came in 2012. I was at Treasury and I guess I was a sort of dissatisfied public servant. You know, when you're an ambitious kind of go-getter, it can be kind of frustrating working in the bureaucracy. And so I decided to just take off for a few years.
Reason why I never worked in the public service.
Yeah, it's difficult.
I would have found it quite hemming in.
It is. And if you've seen me on Twitter, you know I would be a terrible public servant. So
same.
So I went to Michigan, and so I grew up in Queensland, and for someone who grew up at the beach in Queensland to be like dumped in the snow.
I didn't know you were a Queenslander. I'm a Queenslander as well. There you go. Yeah.
Go Maroons.
Yeah,
eh?
absolutely. Up the mighty Maroons.
Did you watch? Yeah. Dumped in Ann Arbor, which is, polar vortex.
Yeah.
It's so cold that the Fahrenheit and Celsius cross. -45 or something.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, and it was the Midwest. So the Midwest is this is the thing about the US that I think a lot of Australians don't appreciate. I think there's a lot more homogeneity in Australian culture than there is in the US.
Yeah.
There are many different Americas, right? And that's true natural in the natural sort of sense of the word, right? Different parts of the country have radically different kind of environments. But culturally, there's huge differences. So, I spent a lot of time in the Midwest. The Midwest is super... it's a bit more like Queensland in the sense that people are very friendly, down to earth, come around to chat to people in the elevator.
Yep.
But here on the East Coast, things are a bit more buttoned down, so there is this diversity in culture across the country, which is really interesting. So the things I love about America are that, on average, I find the stereotype is true in that they are an incredibly entrepreneurial people. So people really push hard, they work hard, maybe the system forces them to do that in a lot of respects, but it generates some pretty incredible things. There are resourceful people, there are, I went to the PhD program with a lot of American students, and the Americans just worked harder. They worked more hours, they put more in, just by nature. And that generates, along with all sorts of other things, really a remarkable it's the biggest, richest country in the world. And the reason for that, I think, partly is cultural. And then there's the flip side, which is sometimes you feel like it's a pretty alienating place. So if you drop something on the footpath, no one's going to come pick it up for you. Whereas you spend 5 minutes back in Australia and it's like bathed in the kind of egalitarian, sea of just wonderful, friendly, kind of generous spirit. And so as someone who kind of lives in both places, I spent a couple of years back during the pandemic, there is a real sense of trade-off. There are wonderful things about America that I love.
Yep.
And then there are wonderful things about Australia that I love.
Yep.
And you can't have them both.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm having this one. And who knows when I'll be back.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I really found that coming here, I think I probably came to it from a slightly different perspective where I came as a pretty critical, I think, person towards America. I had a pretty critical view of America, and the sorts of things that I knew about it were from reading like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, I come from that kind of a background. And then when I got here, I fell in love with so many aspects of it, but definitely noticing that part of it where it's like just that little bit less friendly than Australia. Maybe that's just more because we're here on the East Coast. I haven't been in any of those, sort of Midwestern places. But like just the things that they've been able to do here, like going to all the museums and learning more about the history. I mean, it really is, like you're saying, it's a trade-off. Like clearly it's worked for them in a range of areas, right?
You have to remember there are 15 times as many people in a landmass that's roughly the same.
That's right.
The land masses are actually very close in terms of the contiguous land masses of the US and Australia. And that just remarkable population frames so many things about America that you really notice. You have these scares, big Australia. Kevin Rudd said a big Australia, and then immediately had to backflip. Julie Gillard, stuffed that in a drawer, and we never heard of it again. But America really does have that, and it brings tremendous benefits to the country. So
that's it. Opportunities and challenges that all of that brings along. Now, we're going to drill down a little bit more into the relationship between our two countries, and specifically we're here to talk about AUKUS. Now, everyone who's listening at home might not be fully aware of it, but how would you describe AUKUS? What is it? What's its purpose?
Yeah, I think it was a strategic partnership between the two countries. And I think a lot of people think when they hear AUKUS, they think submarine. And as we were talking about before, submarines are kind of cool. If you're like 100%. Me, you're a young guy, you kind of think, oh, that's cool. But my understanding is that the sort of arrangement is much deeper than that. And it's intended to be broader. I mean, there's no getting around the existence of China and the tensions between China and the US and between China and Australia. This partnership, I think, is framed around that between the UK, the US and Australia as a means of kind of leaning against China as a kind of growing strategic sort of force within the Indo-Pacific. So, I think the key is Australia is in a pretty, how would I put this, strategically important location. And the US obviously has a lot of, advantages in terms of technology, the size of its military. So, England is in, I don't know, to tag along, I guess.
That was going to be my next question. You're like, how did the UK end up in this? When we're so close to China in the Pacific. Yeah,
but you can understand the partnership. Like any partnership needs to have both parties having some comparative advantage there to bring to the table to offer to the other. And, Australia, just its location is incredibly advantageous. So, we can partner with the US. They can provide a lot of the things that we need. We can provide some things they need, and then maybe both of us get something out of the deal.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at an agreement like this, right? Really, I think it boils down into three broad categories. I think there's obviously, just like you've touched on at the start, there's this sort of strategic military lens, which is very overt in an announcement like this. There's also the political or maybe even ideological lens that you could apply to it. And then, of course, there's the economic lens that I'm sure we'll be unpacking given our backgrounds and interests. But before we move into the political and economic ones, sticking with that strategic aspect, you've answered it a little bit, but do you think it really makes sense in the way that it's been sold to everyone? Do you think that they've communicated that really effectively?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's sort of amorphous. I think the problem is it's not clear exactly what it involves. So what is it? I think there's been a lot of discussion, for example, of Australia being on the hook now.
Yep.
Right. So we've been drawn into the US and we're somewhat, subsidiary to the US's decision making, for example. That's the way it's kind of been interpreted by some people. And that's not clear, right? So I think the way that it's been framed it is this kind of hard to define, vague kind of thing that leaves it open to interpretation, right?
Yes.
So, look, I think, pinning it down to more specific things like submarines and exactly what those submarines involve, and now we thankfully have a bit more detail around that. I think lets you assess it more clearly, right? And even frankly, the assessment of that program already has had a lot of, I think, misinterpretation. A lot of people reading too much into things or incorrectly reading into things. But when you look at those specific things, I think, the costs and benefits are fairly clear, and each person then can make kind of an assessment as to whether they think it's a good idea or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And since you're bringing up the subs, let's drill down into that because we're both very obsessed with them. But back home in Australia, the front page news is always the first thing that they'll be talking about is $383 billion. $383 billion.
Drives me mad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But thinking about it from that, applying that more economic lens, what we're looking to get out of it, is it worth that $383 billion? That's the sort of first question that they keep asking on the front pages. What's your take?
Now, here's the thing. So let's just be clear. I'm not a military expert. I am not my friend Sam Roggeveen. Do you know Sam Roggeveen at the Lowy Institute? I listen to him, I listen to other people, right? I read widely and take in a range of views, people at ASPE, where we're sitting right now. But ultimately, no one person has all of the skill set or background necessary to make these judgments, right? So I was, there was recently this Red Scare panel in the Sydney Morning Herald that you would have heard about. I was disappointed they were no economists.
Yeah.
I did think that. I thought, hang on, why didn't they ask an economist here? Because I think actually these are defense procurement questions.
That's right.
Which are fundamentally economic questions,
Yes.
right? So we can't tell you the benefits. I think we have to talk to other people at ASPE and elsewhere about what those benefits are, and we can have that debate. But there are many other questions here that are really fundamentally economic, where people like you or I can kind of, I think, contribute something to that conversation. So I just wanted to, in case we do have any friends in foreign policy listening, they're going to be like,
we have no military
morons?
strategic tactical expertise, so we won't be talking about
missiles and
the
Tomahawk missiles.
That's right.
The benefits of nuclear propulsion. But so here's what I would say. I would say, if you take as given the arguments that the government is making, which is that this is a critical strategic deterrent, right? So it has some value that we have this capability. Take that as given. And there's debate, right?
Absolutely.
Lots of people disagree, but let's just take that as given. The government is certainly assuming that. The question is, what does it cost us? And is that cost worth it? Okay. So when you frame it as $383 billion or whatever, it seems insane, right? But if you frame it, you can frame anything over a 30-year period and it looks insane.
It's going to look ridiculous,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can literally think of any government program, multiply the annual cost by 30, and it would seem just shocking to the average person. And you've heard people use the NDIS as an example to kind of lean against this $383 billion number. I think it's 0.15% of GDP.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, we spend roughly 2% of GDP on defense. Correct. So in that sense, you're increasing defense spending by less than 10% for what is being claimed to be a critical strategic asset. To me, that's clearly fine, right? And I don't think we should worry too much about it. The other thing I would note, though, is it's important to put that into the context of the overall kind of defence picture in Australia, which the recent Defence Strategic Review does. And that review and the way the government approached it, I think, highlights a really important point, which is we could just keep expanding the defence budget without limit.
Yep.
But what I'd prefer to see is some discipline imposed on that defence budget so that the Defence Department and, the people in uniform have to make choices in a constrained way about the best way to achieve the objectives we have.
That's exactly right. And that's what I keep having this conversation, not just in the context of defence spending, but in a range of government expenditure programs. We need to start shifting the conversation from one of cost to one of value. So what are we getting for that $383 billion? Not, is that too much? Is that too little? Things that are worth spending that much money on, things that aren't worth spending that much money on.
Yes, and what do you have to give up?
That's exactly right.
So you have to give up something, right? You've either got to give up high taxes or you've got to give up some other defence capability. And I don't know precisely what ASPI's view is, but my view would be for the first 4 years of the forward estimates, the government decided to make the Defence Department swallow it, right? And I think excellent, right? Before the election, I said, do not give the Defence Department one additional dollar. They waste enough bloody money as it is. Force them to figure out how to afford it. And in fact, that's exactly what the government did, and I think that's good. Now, whether that's
good old constrained optimization,
well,
is
it's
it not?
like you're spending money on tanks, and it's like, when are we going to fight a land war? Are we serious? And so what we got from that Defence Strategic Review, which I think is great, is it's a throwing away of the kind of assumptions and kind of status quo that we've had for a really long time, that, Australia has to be a shrunken down version of the US in terms of our military capabilities, to one that's much more targeted and tailored to our unique circumstances, right?
As an island nation, it makes sense to be spending money on...
Great idea.
That's right.
Artillery and tanks, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
So I think a part of AUKUS that's really important is it's forcing Australia to think critically about our role, about what we're willing to commit to this strategic outcome, and to be a bit more thoughtful about how we use our resources.
Now, stepping the idea of costs and benefits back slightly from the real dollar terms, what is this costing us in our relationship with China, who is such an important trading partner? They're both our lead trading partner and also the sole focus almost of this AUKUS deal. So how do you think that kind of plays out?
Look, I think a better relationship with China is good, and I certainly applaud the new government for, I think, making significant progress on that basis. Like there's tangible progress, and maybe part of that tangible progress is simply we needed a clean sheet, right? Yeah. The Chinese needed a safe face, and so a new government allowed them to do that. I don't know. But a better relationship with China is good, but there's a limit to that, right? And I think that we have to draw a line, and I think we have principles that we are not willing to budge on, and I think that we should hold to those principles. And then the rest is diplomacy, right? Which again, I'm not an expert in, but my view is something from the previous government that I think was unfortunate was that they almost went out of their way to piss them off. Yeah. Right? It's like punch them poke them in the eye. Yep. It's like, can we just leave it? My Chinese friends say, a really important part of Chinese culture is sort of pride. And if it costs you nothing not to bruise the pride of your counterparty, then why not do it? Yeah. Right? Yeah. If it's costless, for God's sake, just do it, right? That's so right. My view is like, let's, China gives us a list of demands. Bugger off. I don't want whatever. I don't want anything to do with that list of demand. We're not going to comply. We're a free country. But, also let's not go out of the way to kind of poke them in the eye. right? And so AUKUS, I think, it depends how we handle it, but I think it's a fine thing to do. I mean, I think Australia is well within its right to build its capabilities. China is doing the same at a much more rapid pace. Pair that with a much better, more kind of delicate, thoughtful diplomatic engagement. And I think that's the way to go.
Well, while I've been here in the US, I've been reading a biography of probably my favorite American president, Teddy Roosevelt. Really fantastic, definitive biography by called Edmund Morris. And do you think this is a case?
You have a bit of a Teddy Roosevelt vibe.
Oh, I could do a whole podcast on Teddy Roosevelt, mate. Like, he's fantastic. But is this a case of his famous saying of, we need to speak softly but carry a big stick?
Absolutely.
Do you think that's what's happening?
Exactly. That's right. That's a perfect encapsulation of the appropriate policy for Australia. So I agree with that.
Now, the other really, I think, critical question that comes up in the Australian media and in the Australian consciousness when we talk about this is the nuclear aspect of the subs, right? Do you think there's any concern that should be paid to that, or do you think it's totally blown out of proportion?
I think that people whinging about the nuclear component have other agendas that I have no interest in engaging with.
Oh, very interesting. That's a subtweet there.
So I'm agnostic about it. I have no qualms about nuclear in any way. Like, I'm not anti-nuclear power. I'm not anti-nuclear propulsion. I think we ought to all be anti-nuclear weapons, but unfortunately they exist. So my view is it's an engineering question.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah.
And if an engineering and I guess strategic question. So if the people who know about that think it's a good idea, there's disagreement about that.
Yeah.
Again, my friend Sam Roggeveen disagrees. But if we agree that it's necessary, then if the economics stacks up, do it. Right. I don't think we should be worried about. I mean, my understanding is the whole purpose of a big part of the American deal is that these things can be basically sealed. And we don't need to refuel them. We don't need to worry about a partner to refuel them. They arrive in Australia in a box and get installed into the submarine and we're done. So who cares what's inside the box?
Now, this brings me to another question on I guess, costs and benefits. When we think about the strategic, a bit of background, I was in the national office for the AMWU and I coordinated the shipbuilding and defence industries there with my great friend Glenn Thompson, the
I didn't know that.
secretary. Yeah, so I have a real, passion for this area and I find it really, really interesting. And we heard the same things when we would talk to, people from the military, the people who know what they're talking about, and they'd say, this is the best way to accomplish the tasks that Australia's unique position, or Australia's naval's unique position.
Yeah, we're a big island in the middle of nowhere.
We've got to cover longer stretches than any other navy in the world. We've got this really, really broad naval border to be patrolling, and all the way through our trading partners and our trade routes. But the question I have over that is not. I'm kind of agnostic in general, but I think generally the Australian people, the attitude has been against nuclear when it's come up. Sure. So I think that's one factor, even if I personally don't have a horse in the race. But what's the opportunity cost by choosing this because it's the easiest, most available strategy rather than investing in other research approaches? What other things we might have been able to accomplish by taking that challenge as an opportunity? Do you follow my thinking? Like,
what do you have in mind?
If we can invest
I don't know what you have in mind.
R&D about, I don't know, like Australia has shown that it's anti-nuclear in general, that's been and I feel like there is a disconnect between us saying
I don't know about submarines. I don't know about submarines. Submarines have this air-independent propulsion. There's alternatives, right?
That's right.
That can happen. I don't know anything about those, but fine. But more broadly, I think the nuclear question... again, I'm agnostic about nuclear. I think if a country has nuclear, they should double down.
Yep.
And the fact that countries like Germany are eliminating nuclear, I just want to bash my head against the wall. Australia doesn't have nuclear. We never did. And I think we just take that as given. My understanding is that moving to nuclear power in Australia makes no sense economically. and we just make the best of what we have, right? And that will force us to do other things, right? Yeah. So you look at the penetration in Australia in rooftop solar, for example.
Yeah, we lead the world.
Compare that to the US or compare that to France or whatever, the UK. We had to take a different path, right? Rooftop solar and decentralized power generation can kind of smooth out some of these like problems with power generation that nuclear would otherwise do. So yeah, I mean, I think the point is no technology is a silver bullet. Yes. No technology is absolutely necessary. I think ideally starting at the start, we want to be agnostic because why pay more than you need to get what you want? But given your constraints, let's do the most efficient thing we can. That would be my argument. So, for example, I think the choice to go with an American submarine rather than a French submarine, that's a question, right? About what the best thing to do is given that choice.
And since we've decided to go down the American route, we've had to tear up all the plans and all the things that have been made.
It's a pretty funny story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, funny is one word.
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of expensive.
Yeah, very, very expensive.
Expensive strategically. Like we have really old submarines. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And like I said, the Collins class, they're really going to be entering the sort of end of their edge of being useful into the 2030s. And we're likely not to see the new submarines being built until the 2040s, if we get to that
and point. They do this life of cycle extension.
Yes, that's
which
right.
when you learn about is actually like literally rebuilding the entire submarine.
Yeah, literally. Yeah, that's right.
Which is kind of like, whoa, really?
That whole question if you replace each part, is it still the same submarine?
No, exactly.
Right?
No, what's that?
The end of it.
The axe. What is it? Anyway,
yeah. But yeah, now to sort of plug that capability gap over the next 15 years, the discussion has been that we'll buy 2 Virginia-class submarines from the Americans in the interim.
Yep. Three. Three, and then we have an option for 2 more.
That's right, yeah.
Could be 5, could be 3, yeah.
That's right. Now, I've been having a lot of conversations while we've been here in Washington, D.C., and it seems like that's the only part of the conversation that the Americans are slightly concerned about, because they're like, why are we selling a couple of hours when we need them?
Interesting.
And
aren't we giving them a bunch of money to build their industrial capacity?
It's literally an exchange for goods and services with money. But
more than that, it's not just we're buying some out from under them. We're helping them expand supply, so we both win, right? I mean, I think that's the idea.
That's right. And currently the shipyards up in Connecticut, they produce about 1.2 a year. Now, when I was speaking to Congressman Joe Courtney's office, who's the congressman, Mr. Shipbuilding, who covers the workforce that are building the Virginia classes, they said that it's actually closer to 1.6 at the moment, and that the 1.2 is very, very bad, sort of rhetoric. But anyway, we'll say between 1.2 and 1.6, and to be able to fulfill the AUKUS agreement, they're going to need 2.5 to 3 per year. Now, that's going to be a massive scale up of their industrial capabilities. And we're really hopeful, at least we are at the Centre for New Industry, that there will be an avenue for Australian workers to be coming over to the US to learn from some of this, so that we can import some of that back, because there is currently a bit of a skills and capabilities gap.
Yes.
Between the ramp down of Collins class and then the ramp up again of the Virginia, or the SSN AUKUS, I should say. They're not going to be exactly Virginia class, but they're going to be built off either that or the Astutes, as we know. Do you see the value in that, and making sure that we are building our sovereign capabilities back in Australia, or do you think it's perfectly fine for us to just be buying these, and it's a waste of money to be doing anything else?
That's a really important. That's probably the most important thing that we'll talk about today, I guess.
Yes.
Now you might, people now if people know me who are listening, then I reckon they're going to have something in their mind about what I'm going to say to this question.
I'm very interested in the answer,
which is, but he's going to hate it. He's going to hate it. He's going to say, go and buy it off the shelf. What are you doing? I was very happy when Australia stopped building cars. I thought that was a good thing because it made immediately every Australian richer, right? Because every job in the car industry cost $200,000 to $300,000, right, to maintain. And I want people to do something else, right? Now there can be a transition, and we've talked about that a lot, you and I, right? With the green transition, and so the government can support people to move, to reskill, right? But I think we can't keep people doing something that has no future. So that's usually my response to questions of industry policy.
Yep. We're going to have to respectfully agree to disagree on that one, but like, I'll let you play it out.
Best thing that government did. Okay, so is there's going to be a lot of very angry people listening to this.
There's a lot of very angry people in this room now, Stephen.
So anyway, but the difference with the subs is it does have a future.
Yep.
Right? I mean, that's the whole point. The whole basis of the agreement is that we are going to have submarines forever.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
more or less forever.
As far as we can imagine.
Right?
Yep.
And we're going to need to build new ones, and then those ones are going to get old, and we're going to need to build new ones after that. And we're just going to keep building forever.
Yep.
And, you know, Australia has the kind of scale that can support, we're buying more submarines than the UK is.
Yeah.
And they have a capability,
Yeah.
right, to build their own submarines. Yep. So, to my mind, if we recognize as a country that this is something we're going to need forever, then of course you should build the capability.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do. The car industry is a question of like, does this make sense for us as a country to produce? Well, it does make sense to make your own submarines for various reasons that we can go into, but it's certainly a capability that isn't just like, this is it and then it's done. We actually need this capability forever. And the way these industries work is that they need constant output. Right? I mean, they've talked a lot about
continuous build,
right?
Yeah.
In the UK, is that you stop building one and you build the next one in order to maintain that skilled workforce, in order to maintain your supply base, all of the things you need.
Yep.
You got to have this thing going forever. So, to my mind, if we are going to commit to this thing, it actually makes perfect sense for Australia to invest in the industrial capability in order to do that. So, you know, my opposition to Australian manufacturing in certain situations is merely just, does it make sense for us to do it? And it just doesn't make sense for us to do lots of things, right? So this seems to be one that it does make sense to do.
I think that's a really interesting position. We won't
Do you feel better now?
We won't delve into the car one because we have very different views on that. But we'll talk about that later after we record this over a couple of beers when we don't have sensitive ears listening. But I think that's both a very interesting point that you make, and that it's not only consistent with everything that you've said previously around the strategic question, which I appreciate, but it's also... You'd be surprised, but that's actually what we talk about as well when we're thinking about industry policy, right? It's like, where does it make sense for us to be spending this money? And if it does make sense, then why would we do it halfway? And I think we're perfectly aligned on that question, and we're in agreement that, unfortunately, submarines will... for the foreseeable future, it'd be a lovely world if we didn't need any military whatsoever and we could all hold hands, but that's not the world that we live in.
But it's also a question of scale.
Yes. Yeah.
Australia's a small market. This was a big problem with the car industry, right? Is that Holden was building like 30,000 cars a year, which, you need a factory to be building between 200,000 and 500,000 cars a year to make sense. And we have geographical disadvantage from being so far away from everyone else that adds a cost to exporting, all of this stuff, right? But a submarine, it's like, well, again, we're going to have higher scale than the UK does. Yeah. And we're not just building submarines, we're building ships, right? We're building all sorts of other
patrol
things.
boats.
And there's a lot of complementarities between these things. So I just, it's something that drives me a bit crazy about both, I wouldn't say all economists, but some economists, and certainly a lot of people on the right, is just a sort of reflexive, unthinking opposition to whole swathes of possibilities.
And treating what are diverse sectors as homogenous.
It's just like industry policy bad, cross.
Yeah.
And I look, I'm sure the listeners, if they know me, thought I was going to say that. But I hope I'm a little bit more enlightened than that. I think we need to look at each situation on its own merits.
Yes.
Assess them. Now, in my opinion, that's very frequently going to end up in an answer that says we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
But not always, right? And I can think of lots of examples where we should.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think this is one of those topics where we could probably be talking about it all night, and we probably will.
Yeah.
But I think that's the really important through line, the important thesis statement of this conversation is that for what if we need to take the strategic question as read, because the government certainly has. So if we're going to be doing this, then we need to be extracting as much value out of it for the Australian people, for the Australian taxpayers who are footing the bill, and for the people who are relying on this industry, making sure that we are building that capability in a way that is sustainable going into the future. So I think our listeners might be surprised to agree that we're ending on a point of very much an agreement on that. But it's been really fantastic to unpack all of these things with you, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming along and having a chat with us. I'm sure our listeners will have enjoyed it, even if they don't agree with everything that's been said.
Don't give them my Twitter handle.
We won't be giving that a shout out. But that's it for another episode of Recap here at Per Capita. I've been Shirley Jackson, joined, of course, by Dr. Stephen Hamilton. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thanks so much for listening to us.
Cheers.
Bye.